Shadows of a Legacy. The sprawling estate of Walter Kensington, renowned billionaire philanthropist, was a vision of architectural splendor. Located on the outskirts of New York City, its lush gardens, marble statues, and towering oak trees painted a picture of timeless elegance. Yet within the opulent mansion, there was a silence so profound it felt suffocating, a silence born of grief. Walter sat alone in his study, staring at a gold-framed photo of his late wife, Eleanor. Her auburn hair shimmered in the sunlight in the picture, and her warm smile seemed to promise an eternity of happiness. Walter ran his thumb along the frame, the ache in his chest as fresh as the day he had lost her in a car accident 2 years ago. She had been the heart of the Kensington Foundation, a charity she had built from the ground up to support orphans and underprivileged children. The foundation was still thriving, but Walter's involvement had grown cold and mechanical. Once a man of vibrant vision and compassion, he now buried himself in the business of mergers, acquisitions, and revenue reports. Each gala and charity event he attended felt like a charade, just another responsibility to fulfill Eleanor's legacy while his heart remained elsewhere. On a particularly crisp autumn morning, Walter received an unusual call from the foundation's director, Sister Margaret, a sharp-witted and kind-hearted nun who had worked alongside Eleanor for years. "Mr. Kensington," she began, her voice tinged with both hesitation and urgency, "I know this might seem sudden, but there's a situation I feel you should know about." Walter sighed. "Is this about the funding delays for the new shelter?" "No," Sister Margaret replied. "It's about a little girl. Her name is Ava. She's 5 years old, and she's been staying at St. Bridget's orphanage since her mother passed away 6 months ago." Walter stiffened. "Why are you telling me this?" "There's something about her. I think Eleanor would have wanted you to meet her," Sister Margaret said softly. "She's special, Mr. Kensington, and there's something you should see for yourself." Walter hesitated. He had long avoided anything that reminded him of Eleanor's work, but there was a rare earnestness in Sister Margaret's voice, and before he could overthink it, he found himself agreeing to visit the orphanage that afternoon. St. Bridget's orphanage stood in stark contrast to the gleaming Kensington estate. The building was old, its brick walls weathered by time, but the children's laughter ringing out from the playground gave it a warmth that no amount of money could buy. Walter stepped out of his black limousine, his tailored suit immaculate, and surveyed the modest surroundings with an air of detachment. Sister Margaret greeted him at the door, her sharp eyes softening as she took in the sight of him. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Kensington. This way, please." She led him to a small common room where a group of children was gathered, their faces lighting up as they spotted the tall, imposing man entering their space. Walter offered a polite smile but stayed near the door, feeling out of place. And then he saw her. Ava was seated on the floor, engrossed in a puzzle. Her dark, curly hair framed a delicate face, her brown eyes full of concentration. Around her neck hung a simple wooden necklace shaped like a star, the carving slightly uneven as if it had been made by hand. Walter's breath caught. That necklace, it was identical to the one he had given Eleanor on their 5th anniversary, a piece he had commissioned from a local artisan. He had thought it lost forever after the accident. "Where did she get that necklace?" Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sister Margaret followed his gaze and smiled. "It was her mother's. Ava never takes it off." Walter's world tilted. The memories he had buried began to resurface, the tender moments he had shared with Eleanor, the passion she had poured into her work with the foundation. His carefully constructed emotional barriers began to crack. Sensing his turmoil, Sister Margaret gently touched his arm. "Ava's story is complicated, Mr. Kensington. She doesn't know much about her mother's past, but I believe there's more to it than meets the eye. Would you like to meet her?" Walter nodded, though his legs felt like lead as he approached the little girl. Ava looked up from her puzzle, her eyes meeting his with a curiosity that seemed far too wise for her age. "Hello," Walter said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I'm Walter." Ava tilted her head. "You look sad," she said simply. Walter was taken aback. He had spent years perfecting the art of masking his emotions, yet this child had seen through him in an instant. "I suppose I am," he admitted, his voice tinged with a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Ava smiled faintly. "Mommy used to say that sad people just need someone to make them feel special." Walter felt a lump rise in his throat. He crouched down to her level, his eyes lingering on the necklace. "Your mommy sounds like she was very kind. Did she make that necklace for you?" Ava nodded. "She said it was her lucky star. She gave it to me before she got sick." Walter's chest tightened. There were too many coincidences, too many unanswered questions. The resemblance to Eleanor's necklace was undeniable, and the timing of Ava's arrival in his life felt almost fated. That night, back at the mansion, Walter sat in his study, the photograph of Eleanor now joined by a new addition, a snapshot of Ava that Sister Margaret had given him before he left the orphanage. He stared at the two images side by side, his mind racing. Who was Ava's mother? How had she come to possess a necklace so deeply tied to his past? And what was he supposed to do now that this little girl had stirred feelings in him he thought he had lost forever? Walter didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. Ava was more than just a child in need of a home. She was a link to a past he could no longer ignore, and perhaps, just perhaps, a key to healing the wounds that had defined his life for far too long. Unraveling the threads of the past. The next morning, Walter woke earlier than usual, the image of Ava and her necklace etched firmly in his mind. He dressed in silence, forgoing his usual meticulously planned suit for a simple sweater and slacks. There was a strange energy coursing through him, an urgency he hadn't felt in years. Ava's eyes, so piercing yet tender, seemed to have awoken something dormant in him. By mid-morning, he was seated in the private office of Sister Margaret, the walls lined with books on theology and social work. The nun's face was kind but watchful, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. "Mr. Kensington," she began, her tone both respectful and firm, "I appreciate your visit yesterday." Ava hasn't stopped talking about the nice man in the big suit. She chuckled lightly. It's rare for her to connect with someone so quickly. Walter leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the desk. "Sister Margaret, I need to know more about Ava's mother. You said she passed away 6 months ago, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more to the story." The nun's expression sobered. Her name was Lucy Grant. "She came to us about 2 years ago, struggling to make ends meet after leaving a difficult situation. She was a bright, compassionate woman, deeply devoted to Ava. But," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "Lucy rarely spoke about her past. She mentioned working with a charity years ago, but she never gave details." Walter's heart skipped a beat. "A charity?" he pressed. "Did she ever say which one?" Sister Margaret shook her head. "No, but she had an undeniable passion for helping others. Even while facing her own hardships, she volunteered here, tutoring the older children and organizing fundraisers. She was remarkable." Walter absorbed the information in silence, the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. "And the necklace?" he asked finally, his voice tight. "Do you know where she got it?" Sister Margaret smiled faintly. "Lucy told me it was a gift from someone she loved dearly, a reminder of hope, she called it. She gave it to Ava before she passed, saying it would protect her." Walter's gaze dropped to his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. The weight of the coincidence was unbearable. Could Lucy have been connected to Eleanor? The thought both excited and terrified him. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Thank you, sister," he said, his voice gruff. "I need to make some inquiries." Back at the Kensington estate, Walter retreated to his private study and opened a locked drawer in his desk. Inside lay a collection of Eleanor's personal effects, things he hadn't touched since her death. Among them was a handwritten journal, its pages filled with her dreams and plans for the foundation. He flipped through the entries, his fingers trembling. Then he found it, a name scrawled in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Lucy Grant. The date beside it was from 6 years ago, around the time Eleanor had launched a grassroots initiative to support women and children in need. Walter's heart raced as he read further. Lucy Grant has the kind of spirit that inspires hope even in the darkest times. Her determination to build a better future for her daughter is a reminder of why we do this work. I'm planning to make her a project coordinator at the Eastside Women's Shelter. She deserves every chance to thrive. He closed the journal, his mind spinning. Eleanor had known Lucy, worked with her, believed in her. But what had happened after? Why had Lucy ended up struggling so much? And how did she come to possess a necklace identical to the one he had given Eleanor? Determined to uncover the truth, Walter made a call to Meredith Clark, his longtime assistant. Within an hour, she was seated in his study, a legal pad and tablet at the ready. "I need you to pull up every record we have on the Eastside Women's Shelter," Walter said without preamble. "Staff lists, financials, project reports, everything from 6 years ago until it closed." Meredith frowned. The Eastside Women's Shelter. That was one of Eleanor's pet projects, wasn't it? But it was shut down a few years ago during the corporate restructuring. Walter stiffened. "What do you mean, corporate restructuring?" Meredith hesitated. "It was part of the development plan for Kensington Holdings. The shelter was on a prime piece of land, and the board voted to repurpose it for a luxury condominium project. You signed off on it, sir." Walter's stomach dropped. He vaguely remembered the decision, buried amid countless other proposals during a time when he was consumed by grief. He had trusted his board to handle the details, never questioning the human cost of their choices. "I need those records," he said tightly. "And I need them today." As Meredith worked to gather the information, Walter drove back to Street Bridget's, unable to stay idle. Ava was in the garden, her small frame dwarfed by the vibrant sunflowers swaying in the breeze. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a smile. "Mr. Walter," she called, running to him. Her wooden necklace bounced against her chest as she moved, a stark reminder of the mystery that had brought him here. Walter crouched to her level. "Hello, Ava. What are you up to today?" "Planting flowers," she said proudly, holding up a small trowel. "Mommy loved flowers. She said they made people happy." Walter felt a pang in his chest. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're very much like her, aren't you?" Ava nodded solemnly. "That's what Sister Margaret says. She says Mommy had a big heart." Walter smiled faintly, though his mind was elsewhere. "Ava, do you remember anything about the people your mommy worked with? Did she ever talk about a lady named Eleanor?" Ava tilted her head, thinking. "I don't know, but Mommy always said there was someone who helped her when she needed it most. She said that person was her angel." Walter swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He pulled Ava into a gentle hug, her small arms wrapping around his neck. That evening, Meredith returned to the estate with a stack of files. Walter spent hours poring over the documents, his guilt mounting with every page. The Eastside Women's Shelter had been a lifeline for dozens of families, and its closure had left many without a safety net. Lucy Grant's name appeared repeatedly in the records, along with glowing recommendations from Eleanor. But there was no mention of what happened to her after the shelter shut down. Among the files was a photograph, a candid shot of Eleanor and Lucy standing side by side, their smiles radiant. In Lucy's arms was a baby with dark curls and wide brown eyes. "Ava." Walter stared at the image, his chest tightening. The connection was undeniable. Eleanor had been a part of Ava's life, even if only briefly. And now, by some twist of fate, Ava had come into his. Late that night, Walter stood on the balcony of his mansion, staring out at the city lights. The weight of his past decisions bore down on him, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of purpose. He didn't yet know what Ava's arrival in his life meant or how he would reconcile the sins of his past. But one thing was clear. He owed it to Eleanor, to Lucy, and most of all to Ava, to make things right. The ghosts of decisions. The grand estate sat cloaked in the quiet of early morning, the first rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the carefully manicured gardens. Walter Kensington was not a man who typically woke with the dawn, but this morning was different. The threads of his past had become a web, and at its center was a child. Ava, with her gentle smile and a wooden star pendant that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Walter sat in his study, sipping a black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The files Meredith had brought him the previous night were spread across his desk, accompanied by Eleanor's handwritten notes from her journal. The picture of Eleanor, Lucy, and baby Ava stared back at him like a ghost, a reminder of all the lives his decisions had touched, and often broken. By mid-morning, Meredith arrived, her face drawn with concern. She placed a fresh stack of documents on Walter's desk. "These are the legal papers related to the closure of the East Side Women's Shelter," she said, her voice hesitant. "I thought you'd want to see the board's justification for the project." Walter opened the folder, his jaw tightening as he read through the memos and reports. The shelter had been marked as non-essential to the foundation's long-term strategy. Profits from the luxury condominium project had been projected to exceed $50 million. His signature was scrawled at the bottom of the approval page. "How did I miss this?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I signed off on something that destroyed everything Eleanor worked for." Meredith placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You were grieving, Walter. You trusted the board to handle these decisions. It doesn't excuse it," he snapped, though his anger was directed inward. He sighed, softening his tone. "Thank you, Meredith. I need to think." That afternoon, Walter visited his family's lawyer, George Whitman, a seasoned attorney who had been with the Kensington family for decades. George greeted him warmly, but raised an eyebrow at the stack of papers Walter handed him. "This is quite the file," George remarked. "What are you looking for?" "I need to know if there's any way to undo what was done," Walter said. The East Side Women's Shelter. It was more than just a building. It was a lifeline for people like Lucy Grant, and I tore it down without a second thought. George frowned as he skimmed through the documents. Reversing a decision like this would be complicated. The property was sold, the shelter demolished. Legally, everything was above board. Walter's shoulders sagged. "So there's nothing I can do." "I didn't say that," George replied, setting the papers aside. "You can't undo the past, but you can rebuild. Establish a new shelter, dedicate resources to help the families who were displaced. It won't erase what happened, but it's a start." Back at the mansion, Walter found Ava in the library, her small frame curled up on the oversized couch. She was reading the picture book, her lips moving silently as she traced the words with her finger. The sight made him pause, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. "Hi, Mr. Walter," Ava said, looking up with a bright smile. "Hi, Ava," he replied, his voice softer than usual. He sat beside her, glancing at the book in her lap. "What are you reading?" "It's about a little girl who plants a garden," Ava said excitedly. "She grows flowers and vegetables and gives them to all her neighbors." Walter smiled faintly. "That sounds lovely. Do you like gardens?" Ava nodded enthusiastically. "Mommy and I used to plant flowers at our old house. She said flowers make people happy." Walter felt a lump rise in his throat. "Your mommy sounds like she was a very special person." "She was," Ava said matter-of-factly, her fingers absently touching the wooden star around her neck. "She always said the world needs more kindness." Walter stared at the pendant, his thoughts racing. "Ava," he began carefully, "do you remember anything about your mommy's work? Did she ever talk about a place called the East Side Women's Shelter?" Ava's brow furrowed as she thought. "I don't know, but she talked about a lady who helped her a lot. She said that lady was like her angel." Walter's breath caught. "Did she ever say the lady's name?" Ava shook her head. "No, but she had a picture of her. It was in a box with some of Mommy's other things." Walter's heart raced. Do you know where the box is? Ava's face lit up. It's at the orphanage. Sister Margaret keeps it in her office. That evening, Walter returned to Street Bridget's. Sister Margaret greeted him with her usual warmth, but raised an eyebrow when he mentioned Ava's box. "Why are you so interested in it, Mr. Kensington?" she asked. "There might be something in there that can help me understand the connection between Lucy and Eleanor," he said earnestly. "Please, Sister Margaret, I need to see it." The nun hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Follow me." She led him to a small storage room and retrieved a battered cardboard box from a shelf. "This is all that was left when Lucy passed," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Walter opened the box carefully. Inside were a few faded photographs, a journal, and a collection of small trinkets. His hands trembled as he picked up one of the photos. It was another picture of Eleanor and Lucy, this time with a group of women and children at the shelter. Eleanor's arm was draped around Lucy's shoulders, their smiles radiating warmth and camaraderie. Beneath the photos was a folded piece of paper. Walter unfolded it and felt his breath catch. It was a letter from Eleanor to Lucy, written in her elegant script. "Dear Lucy, you have a light within you that shines even in the darkest times. Watching you fight for your daughter's future inspires me more than I can say. I hope this small gift reminds you that you're never alone. The world needs more people like you. With love, Eleanor." Walter's gaze dropped to the bottom of the box, where he found a small velvet pouch. He opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a matching wooden star pendant. That night, Walter sat alone in his study, the two pendants lying side by side on his desk. The truth was undeniable. Eleanor had given one to Lucy, and Lucy had passed it on to Ava. The connection between them ran deeper than he had imagined. For the first time in years, Walter allowed himself to cry, not just for Eleanor, but for Lucy, for Ava, and for the choices he had made that had led to so much pain. But with the tears came resolve. He would not let their stories end in tragedy. He would rebuild what he had destroyed and ensure that Ava's future was brighter than her past. As the sun rose the next morning, Walter felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. This was his chance to honor Eleanor's legacy, to atone for his mistakes, and to give Ava the life she deserved. A plan for redemption. The morning dawned cold and gray, but Walter Kensington felt a fire in his chest as he sat at his desk, poring over blueprints and financial projections. His study, once a shrine to his solitude, was now a war room for his redemption. Beside him sat Meredith, her tablet in hand, dutifully jotting down every detail as Walter outlined his vision. "We'll rebuild the East Side Women's Shelter," Walter said firmly, pointing to a plot of land he had already identified in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. Not just a shelter, a community center, housing, childcare, education programs. "I want it to be a sanctuary." Meredith nodded, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. "This is ambitious, Walter, the kind of project that could take years." "I don't care how long it takes," Walter said, his voice steady. "It's not just about the shelter. It's about setting things right." Meredith hesitated. "And what about Ava? Have you thought about how this affects her?" Walter leaned back in his chair, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "She's the reason I'm doing this, Meredith. She deserves to know her mother's legacy wasn't destroyed by my mistakes." Meredith studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then let's make it happen." An unexpected encounter. The next step in Walter's plan involved confronting a past he had long avoided. He contacted Bernard King, a private investigator he trusted implicitly, and arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe in the heart of the city. "Mr. Kensington," Bernard greeted him, sliding into the booth across from him. "You've given me a lot to work with. What's on your mind?" Walter pushed the photograph of Eleanor and Lucy across the table, alongside the letter he had found in Ava's box. "I need to know everything about Lucy Grant's life after the shelter closed. Where she went, who she was with, and how she ended up at Street Bridget's." Bernard frowned, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. I've already started digging into Lucy's background. There's one name that keeps popping up. A man named Victor Haynes. He was her landlord at the time, but his record isn't exactly clean." "What kind of record?" Walter asked, his jaw tightening. "Fraud, extortion, and rumors of human trafficking," Bernard replied grimly. "Lucy may have been trying to get away from him when she ended up at the orphanage." Walter felt a surge of anger, both at Victor Haynes and at himself for ever allowing the shelter's closure to force Lucy into such a precarious situation. "Find him," he said, his voice like steel, "and find out what he knows." Ava's new world. Meanwhile, back at the Kensington estate, Ava was settling into her new life. The once silent mansion was now filled with the sound of her laughter as she explored its many rooms and gardens. Walter had hired a tutor, Miss Valerie, to work with Ava in the mornings, but it was clear that Ava's favorite time of day was the afternoons, when Walter would take a break from his work to spend time with her. One crisp autumn afternoon, Walter found Ava in the garden, crouched over a patch of soil. She had insisted on planting a flower bed, and now her small hands were covered in dirt as she carefully patted the earth around a row of tulip bulbs. "Look, Mr. Walter," Ava said excitedly, holding up a tiny bulb. "This one's going to be purple. That's Mommy's favorite color." Walter knelt beside her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're quite the gardener, Ava. Your mom would be proud." Ava's expression turned thoughtful as she dusted off her hands. "Do you think she can see me from heaven?" Walter felt a lump rise in his throat. "I think so," he said softly. "And I think she's very proud of how brave and kind you are." Ava beamed at his words, her smile lighting up the gray afternoon. Walter watched her for a moment, marveling at how someone so small could carry such resilience. The shadows return. That evening, Bernard called with news that sent a chill down Walter's spine. "I found Victor Haynes," the investigator said. "He's been asking questions about Ava. I think he knows she's with you." Walter gripped the phone tightly. "What does he want?" "Money, most likely," Bernard replied. "He's in debt and desperate. But there's something else. He has documents that suggest he was involved in a custody dispute with Lucy before she passed." Walter's blood ran cold. "Custody? How is that possible?" "Lucy may have been trying to keep Ava away from him," Bernard explained. "The records are murky, but it looks like she was planning to fight him in court before she died." Walter's mind raced. If Victor Haynes had any legal claim to Ava, it could jeopardize everything. "What do I need to do?" he asked. "Get ahead of this," Bernard advised. "File for legal guardianship immediately, and be prepared for a fight." Legal maneuvers. The next morning, Walter met with George Whitman to discuss the situation. The seasoned attorney listened carefully as Walter explained what Bernard had uncovered. "If Haynes has a documented history of criminal activity, we can use that to argue that he's unfit to care for Ava," George said. "But we'll need character witnesses and evidence of Ava's well-being under your care." "I'll do whatever it takes," Walter said firmly. "She belongs here." Over the next few weeks, Walter worked tirelessly to build his case. He reached out to Sister Margaret, who provided glowing testimony about Ava's transformation since coming to live with him. Meredith helped gather records of Walter's newfound philanthropic efforts, including the plans for the new community center. But as the legal proceedings loomed, Walter couldn't shake the fear that he might lose Ava. She had become more than just a reminder of Eleanor's legacy. She was his family. A night of revelation. One stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the mansion, Walter found himself unable to sleep. He wandered the halls, his thoughts restless, until he heard the soft murmur of voices coming from the library. Peeking inside, he saw Ava curled up with Meredith on the couch. Meredith was reading aloud from a storybook, her voice warm and soothing. Ava's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she clung to every word. Walter lingered in the doorway, a wave of gratitude washing over him. For so long, his life had been defined by loss and isolation. But now, with Ava and the people who had come into his life because of her, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. As he turned to leave, Ava's sleepy voice called out to him, "Mr. Walter." He turned back, his heart softening at the sight of her small face peeking over the blanket. "Yes, Ava. Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her eyes wide with innocence. Walter crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her small hand in his. "Yes, Ava," he said firmly. "We're going to be just fine. I promise." The fight for family. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds of the previous night, casting a golden glow over the Kensington estate. Yet Walter's mood was far from serene. The looming custody battle with Victor Haynes weighed heavily on him, a dark cloud over what should have been a time of healing and rebuilding. Walter stood in the library, gazing out at the sprawling gardens, where Ava played with Meredith and Miss Valerie. The sight of her laughter, carefree and pure, only deepened his resolve. She deserved to grow up surrounded by love and security, not the shadows of a past filled with uncertainty and danger. His phone buzzed on the nearby desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Bernard King. "Haynes contacted me. He wants a meeting. Tonight." A dangerous proposition. That evening, Walter sat across from Victor Haynes in a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city. The man before him was a stark contrast to the polished businessman Walter usually dealt with. Haynes was rough around the edges, his clothes unkempt, his eyes sharp and calculating. There was an air of desperation about him that Walter found unsettling. "So you're the big-shot billionaire who thinks he can just take what's mine," Haynes said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Ava is my blood, Kensington. You can't change that." Walter's jaw tightened. "Blood doesn't make you a father," he said evenly. "You've had no role in her life. Lucy wanted to protect Ava from you, and I intend to honor her wishes." Haynes laughed bitterly. "Protect her? From what? A guy who's down on his luck. I'm not a saint, Kensington, but I'm not the monster you think I am. And let's not forget, you're not exactly squeaky clean. How many families did you displace with your little development projects?" Walter's stomach churned at the jab, but he didn't let it show. "This isn't about me. It's about Ava. And you and I both know you're not equipped to care for her." Haynes leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "I could make this very messy for you, or we could work something out." Walter's eyes narrowed. "What are you asking for?" "Money," Haynes said bluntly. "Enough to clear my debts and start over. You give me that, and I'll disappear. No lawyers, no custody fights." Walter's fists clenched under the table. The thought of negotiating Ava's future like a business deal made his blood boil. "You're not getting a cent from me," he said coldly. "If you try to take this to court, I'll make sure every detail of your record comes to light." Haynes's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that," he said, standing abruptly. "You might have money, Kensington, but I've got the law on my side. Ava's my daughter, and I'm not going anywhere." Building a case. Back at the estate, Walter met with George Whitman and Bernard King to prepare for the legal battle ahead. The conference room table was covered with documents, photographs, and testimony from people who had known Lucy and Ava. "We have enough to argue that Haynes is unfit," George said, tapping a file filled with evidence of Haynes's criminal history. "But the court will want to see proof of Ava's well-being under your care. We'll need to highlight her progress since she's been with you." Meredith, who had joined the meeting, spoke up. "Ava has blossomed here. She's thriving emotionally, socially, and academically. We can have her tutor and Sister Margaret testify to that." "And the community center?" Walter asked. "How soon can we get it off the ground?" George frowned. "The project will help bolster your case, but it's a long-term initiative. The court will focus on immediate factors: your ability to provide a stable home, your connection to Ava, and Haynes's past." Walter nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll give them everything they need to see that Ava belongs here." Ava's fears. Later that evening, Walter found Ava in the living room, drawing at the coffee table. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. But as he sat beside her, he noticed the shadows under her eyes and the tension in her small shoulders. "Are you okay, Ava?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her crayon hovering over the paper. "Miss Valerie said you're going to court. Does that mean someone wants to take me away?" Walter's chest tightened. He had tried to shield her from the details of the custody battle, but Ava was perceptive, far more than he had given her credit for. "No one is going to take you away," he said firmly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I promise you that." Tears welled up in her eyes. "But what if they do? What if I have to leave this house? I don't want to go, Mr. Walter. I like it here. I feel safe." Walter pulled her into a hug, his heart breaking at her fear. "You're not going anywhere, Ava," he whispered. "I'll do everything in my power to keep you here. You're my family now." The courtroom battle. The day of the custody hearing arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Walter entered the courtroom flanked by George, Meredith, and Bernard. Across the aisle sat Victor Haynes, his smug expression a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere. The proceedings were grueling. Haynes's lawyer argued that as Ava's biological father, he had a right to custody. They painted Walter as a man trying to buy his way into parenthood, using his wealth to overshadow Haynes's natural bond with Ava. But George was relentless. He presented evidence of Haynes's criminal past, including his connections to unsavory dealings. Witnesses like Sister Margaret and Meredith testify to Ava's growth and happiness under Walter's care. Even Ava's tutor, Miss Valerie, spoke passionately about the bond between Walter and Ava. The most poignant moment came when Walter himself took the stand. "I'm not Ava's biological father," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I love her as if she were my own. I see in her the best parts of her mother: kindness, resilience, and a determination to make the world a better place. I failed her mother once. I won't fail Ava." A verdict and a promise. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. Full custody was awarded to Walter Kensington. Relief flooded through him as he turned to see Ava, who had been waiting with Meredith, run into his arms. "Does this mean I get to stay?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. "Yes, Ava," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're home. A new beginning." In the weeks that followed, Walter poured his energy into the community center, now named the Eleanor and Lucy Foundation. It was a place of hope and healing, a testament to the women who had inspired him to change. Ava often accompanied him to the construction site, her laughter bringing life to the once quiet spaces. Together, they planted a garden at the center's entrance, filled with the flowers Ava loved most. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Walter sat with Ava on the steps of the nearly completed center. She leaned against him, her wooden star pendant catching the golden light. "Do you think Mommy and Mrs. Eleanor are happy now?" she asked softly. Walter wrapped an arm around her, a sense of peace settling over him. "I think they're smiling down on us, Ava, and I think they're proud of you." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Walter knew that while the past could never be undone, the future was a canvas waiting to be filled with light, love, and second chances, a legacy of light. The grand opening of the Eleanor and Lucy Foundation Center was set for a sunny Saturday afternoon. Invitations had gone out to community leaders, former residents of the East Side Women's Shelter, and every person touched by Eleanor and Lucy's legacy. The center's courtyard was abuzz with activity as workers added final touches to the stage and children from the local neighborhood practiced a song they would perform during the ceremony. Walter Kensington stood off to the side, his sharp suit tailored perfectly, but his gaze was distant as he surveyed the gathering crowd. Ava tugged at his hand, her excitement bubbling over. "Mr. Walter, look. They're putting balloons everywhere," she exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of colorful balloons tied to the garden fence. She wore a lavender dress, the color her mother had loved, and her wooden star pendant glimmered in the sunlight. Walter knelt beside her, smiling. "Do you like it? This place is as much yours as it is anyone else's." Ava grinned, but her eyes wandered toward the large banner hanging above the entrance, which read, "A beacon of hope for generations to come." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Do you think Mommy would like it?" Walter placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know she would. She'd love how you're making this place special for everyone. A day to remember." The ceremony began with speeches from community leaders, each one praising the vision and dedication that had brought the center to life. Sister Margaret spoke of Lucy Grant's unwavering spirit and Eleanor Kensington's compassionate heart. Walter listened intently, his chest tightening as he thought about the sacrifices both women had made. When it was his turn to speak, Walter approached the podium, the crowd falling silent in anticipation. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces before him. Ava stood in the front row, her expression a mix of pride and encouragement. "This center represents more than just bricks and mortar," Walter began, his voice steady. "It's a testament to the power of compassion and resilience. Eleanor and Lucy believed in lifting others up, in creating a world where no one is forgotten. Their work inspired me to not only honor their memory but to learn from my mistakes." He paused, glancing at Ava. "When I met Ava, she reminded me of the responsibility we all have to one another. She showed me that even in the darkest times, there is hope." The audience erupted into applause, but Walter barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on Ava, who beamed back at him, her small hands clapping enthusiastically. Revelations in the garden. As the festivities continued, Walter slipped away to the garden behind the center. It was quiet there, the flowers Ava had helped plant swaying gently in the breeze. He needed a moment to reflect, to absorb the gravity of what they had accomplished. Ava found him there, carrying 2 small cups of lemonade. "You looked thirsty," she said, handing him one. Walter chuckled, accepting the cup. "Thank you, Ava. You're always thinking of others." She sat beside him on the stone bench, her legs swinging back and forth. "I'm glad we did this. It feels like Mommy is here." Walter nodded, his gaze distant. "She is, in a way. And so is Eleanor." Ava's small fingers touched her star pendant. "Do you think Mommy and Mrs. Eleanor knew each other in heaven?" Walter hesitated, then said, "They knew each other before heaven. Ava, Eleanor helped your mom a long time ago, back when she was building this foundation." Ava's eyes widened. "Really?" Walter nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Your mom was a remarkable woman. She fought hard for you, even when things were difficult. And Eleanor saw that. She wanted to help." Ava smiled softly, the weight of his words settling in. "So that's why you wanted to help me." Walter leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Partly, but mostly because you're you, Ava. You've taught me more about love and kindness than I ever thought possible." An unfinished chapter. In the weeks following the grand opening, the center became a bustling hub of activity. Families found refuge in its transitional housing, children attended after-school programs, and volunteers poured in to help. Walter visited often, sometimes bringing Ava along. She had become something of a mascot for the center, her bright energy lifting everyone's spirits. One afternoon, Sister Margaret approached Walter as he watched Ava reading to a group of younger children in the corner of the library. The sight warmed his heart, but Sister Margaret's expression was serious. "Walter," she began, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about Victor Haynes." Walter's jaw tightened. "What about him?" Sister Margaret hesitated, then said, "He contacted me. He wants to visit Ava." Walter's heart sank. The court had ruled against Haynes, but he hadn't expected the man to simply disappear. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd speak to you," Sister Margaret said calmly. "He seemed different, humbled, perhaps. He said he doesn't want custody, just a chance to explain himself." Walter frowned, his mind racing. Could Haynes be trusted? Or was this another ploy to exploit Ava for his own gain? The meeting. After much deliberation, Walter agreed to meet Victor Haynes at a neutral location. The man who arrived was a shadow of the smug, defiant figure Walter had encountered weeks earlier. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes downcast. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," Haynes began, his voice rough. "But I need you to know, I never wanted to hurt Lucy or Ava. I messed up, and I let them down. I've been trying to make things right, but it's too late for that now." Walter studied him, his emotions a mix of anger and pity. "If you're here to ask for money—" "No," Haynes interrupted, shaking his head. "I don't want anything from you. I want Ava to know the truth, that her mother loved her more than anything, and that I wasn't there when it mattered most." Walter's expression softened slightly. "Ava doesn't need reminders of the pain you caused. She's healing. She's happy." Haynes nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Then let her stay that way. I won't come near her again. I just needed you to know I'm sorry." Moving forward, true to his word, Haynes disappeared from their lives, leaving Walter and Ava to build their future without his shadow looming over them. The center flourished, its programs expanding to reach even more families in need. Walter continued to dedicate himself to the work, finding a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Ava, too, found her place in this new life. She excelled in school, made friends easily, and often accompanied Walter to the center, where she became a beacon of hope for other children. A new legacy. One evening, Walter and Ava stood on the balcony of the mansion, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Ava leaned against the railing, her star pendant catching the glow of the moonlight. "Do you think we'll always be this happy?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Walter smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Happiness isn't something that just happens, Ava. It's something we build, piece by piece, every day. And as long as we have each other, I think we'll do just fine." Ava tilted her head up to look at him, her eyes bright. "I think Mommy and Mrs. Eleanor would be proud." Walter's heart swelled. "I know they would." As they stood together under the stars, Walter felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had been one of loss, mistakes, and redemption, but it had led him to this moment, a life filled with love, purpose, and the unbreakable bond of family. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. And as Ava's laughter echoed into the night, Walter knew that the future was brighter than he had ever dared to imagine. A legacy of light. As the months passed, Walter continued to find his purpose in the work at the Eleanor and Lucy Foundation Center. What had begun as an act of redemption had blossomed into a true legacy of love and service, something that was now bigger than Walter himself. It was a place where hope was cultivated every day, and the community began to thrive in ways that had once seemed impossible. But despite the undeniable progress, a deep, quiet restlessness had settled in Walter's heart. He had done everything to honor the memories of Eleanor and Lucy, to atone for his past mistakes, but he couldn't help but feel that there was still one thing missing, a deeper connection with the world outside the Foundation's walls. His work had become his life, and yet it still felt incomplete. The unexpected visitor. One chilly autumn afternoon, Walter sat alone in his office, reviewing grant applications for the center's new outreach programs. The familiar hum of the air conditioning and the soft shuffle of papers provided a semblance of comfort, but his mind kept wandering to Ava and the future they were building together. He'd never felt such a strong desire to keep her safe, to ensure that nothing could tear apart the new life they had found. As the clock ticked past 5, the door to his office opened without a knock. Walter looked up, startled. Standing in the doorway was none other than Sister Margaret, her worn face breaking into a soft smile. "Walter," she said warmly, stepping inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Walter stood and extended his hand. "Sister Margaret, of course not. What brings you by this evening?" Sister Margaret took a seat across from his desk. "I've been visiting some of the families at the shelter, and I wanted to update you on a few things. But that's not really why I came here tonight." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Oh, What's on your mind? Sister Margaret hesitated, her eyes flicking to the window before returning to him. There's a little girl who's been coming around recently. She's about 6, maybe 7 years old. Her name is Sarah. Walter frowned. I don't believe I've heard of her. She's been living with her grandmother for the past couple of years. But after her grandmother fell ill, Sarah's been going from one foster home to another. She's been asking about Ava. She's heard stories about the center, and she believes it's a place where she could finally belong. Walter's heart twisted at the thought. There were so many children like Sarah, children who needed love, guidance, and stability, and he realized, for the first time in a long while, that he wasn't finished. His work, the legacy of Eleanor, and his promise to Ava weren't isolated to just one child, or even one community. There was a much bigger need. Is she in need of a home? Walter asked carefully. Sister Margaret nodded. Yes, but more importantly, she's been through so much already, Walter. I've never seen a child with such a deep need to connect, to be seen and understood. I think she's been waiting for someone to show her she matters. Walter stared out the window for a moment, the weight of Sister Margaret's words settling over him. He hadn't considered the possibility of taking another child into his care, especially not so soon. But he knew that, if he truly believed in the mission of the center, he had to be willing to open his heart just a little more. A new beginning. A week later, Walter and Ava met Sarah for the first time. She was a small, quiet girl, her eyes full of sadness, but also a flicker of hope that made Walter's heart ache. She had messy brown hair, a soft round face, and wore an oversized coat that seemed too big for her. Despite her small stature, there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. Walter knelt down to Sarah's level as she sat on one of the benches in the community center's courtyard. Ava stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. Hello, Sarah, Walter said, his voice gentle. I'm Walter. This is Ava. Sarah looked at him with wide eyes. Hi, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Ava smiled at Sarah, her wooden star pendant gleaming in the sunlight. Do you like flowers? She asked, pointing to the small garden they had planted together at the center. Sarah nodded hesitantly. I do. I like daisies. Me too, Ava exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. We can plant them together. Walter watched as the two girls began chatting and bonding over the garden, something that had once been a symbol of Ava's own healing. There was something so simple and pure about their connection. No barriers, no expectations. Just two children finding joy in the small things. As he stood back and watched the girls together, Walter felt the stirring of something deep within him. This wasn't just about the legacy of Eleanor or Lucy anymore. It was about something even larger, building a foundation of love and care that could extend far beyond what he had imagined. The growth of the foundation. In the months that followed, Walter continued to invest in Sarah's future. Just as with Ava, he made sure that Sarah had the stability she needed to heal and grow. He involved her in the daily operations of the center, introducing her to the children they helped and fostering a sense of family that had once seemed so distant to him. But Sarah was not the only child who needed guidance. As the center expanded, Walter saw more and more children like her, lost, uncertain, and yearning for love. Each one was different, but they all shared one common trait. They had been forgotten. Their voices had gone unheard, their potential untapped. But at the foundation, that was changing. Soon, the center was more than just a shelter. It had become a true community, one that Walter could be proud of, and one that offered hope to children who might otherwise never have had the chance to thrive. The realization. One quiet evening, as Walter sat in his study, reflecting on everything he had done, he realized something profound. He had come into this journey seeking redemption for his past mistakes, but in doing so, he had stumbled upon something far more important. The understanding that redemption wasn't just about making amends for the things he had done wrong. It was about choosing to live a life that made a real difference in the lives of others. Ava and Sarah had shown him that it wasn't the past that defined him, but the present, the choices he made every day to show love, to offer care, and to be a beacon of light for others. Through them, Walter had rediscovered a piece of himself he had buried for too long. As he stood before the window, looking out at the growing foundation and the children who had found hope there, Walter knew he was no longer just a man haunted by his mistakes. He was a man who had learned to build something better from those mistakes, something that would live on long after he was gone. A new chapter. That night, as Walter walked down the hallway to Ava and Sarah's room, he found them sitting together on the floor, surrounded by books and stuffed animals. Ava was reading aloud, her voice full of joy as Sarah listened intently, her eyes bright with wonder. The sight was so ordinary, so simple, and yet it filled Walter with a deep sense of peace. He paused in the doorway, watching them, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had never imagined that his life would turn out this way, that he would be a father not just to one, but to many. But as he stood there, witnessing the warmth and laughter of his home, he realized that the love he had built here was enough. It was more than enough. As the girls glanced up and saw him standing there, they both smiled, their eyes full of affection. Ava waved excitedly. "Mr. Walter, come read with us." Walter stepped into the room, his heart full. This was what family looked like. This was what legacy truly meant. "I'll be right there," he said, smiling warmly as he joined them on the floor, and as he settled into place, surrounded by the two girls who had changed his life. He knew that the foundation he had built would continue to grow, shaping lives for generations to come. The story came full circle, not just in Walter's personal journey, but in the way he had come to redefine family, love, and legacy. The past, filled with mistakes, had given way to a future brimming with purpose, a future built on the promise of redemption, love, and hope.